At the height of the British Empire, the sun did not set on its territories. That sentence sounds like a boast. But for hundreds of millions of people, it was also a warning. Somewhere beneath that endless sun, a British official was signing a treaty, drawing a border, collecting a tax, ordering a regiment forward, or deciding the price of grain in a land he had never truly understood. From the misty docks of London, decisions traveled across oceans and changed lives in India, Africa, the Caribbean, the Middle East, Australia, Canada, and islands so distant that many people in Britain could not find them on a map. A kingdom built on a relatively small group of islands came to rule, control, or dominate roughly a quarter of the world's land and population. It commanded sea routes, telegraph cables, trading ports, armies, banks, plantations, railways, and governments. It carried laws, machines, and the English language across the planet. It also carried chains, guns, extraction, famine, displacement, and borders whose consequences would outlive the empire itself. And the strangest part is this. Britain did not begin as the obvious master of the world. It was not the largest country in Europe. It did not have the greatest population. It did not possess the richest soil, the biggest army, or the oldest imperial tradition. For much of its early history, England was invaded, divided, and threatened by stronger powers. The Romans conquered it. Viking armies raided it. Norman knights seized its crown. Spain seemed wealthier. France seemed stronger. The Dutch seemed more advanced in commerce. And yet, over the course of several centuries, Britain learned how to turn vulnerability into strategy. It used geography as a shield. It used ships as weapons. It used merchants as scouts. It used private companies as governments. It borrowed money on a scale that frightened its rivals. It fought wars far from home and made other peoples pay for them. When it lost one empire in America, it built another in Asia. When slavery became politically indefensible, it recast itself as the power that had abolished the trade it had helped expand. When direct conquest became too expensive, it ruled through local princes, colonial officials, settlers, financiers, and carefully chosen allies. And when the empire finally began to collapse, Britain tried to turn retreat into ceremony. Flags were lowered. Anthems were played. New nations were born. But the old structures did not disappear with the old uniforms. The empire's greatest strength had always been its ability to hide power behind systems. A ship could look like commerce. A company could behave like a state. A railway could promise progress while carrying troops and raw materials. A treaty could appear voluntary even when warships waited in the harbor. A map could look orderly while dividing communities that had lived together for centuries. By the end of this story, the British Empire will not look like one unstoppable machine. It will look like something more dangerous and more human. A chain of gambles. A collection of accidents. A system built by merchants, monarchs, soldiers, enslaved laborers, colonists, sailors, rebels, financiers, missionaries, administrators, and millions of people who resisted, adapted, survived, or were destroyed by it. Because the British Empire was never created in a single moment. It was assembled piece by piece, port by port, war by war, debt by debt, and it began long before anyone could imagine a red-colored map covering the world. In the late 15th century, the future empire was still a distant possibility. England had only recently emerged from the Wars of the Roses, a brutal struggle among noble families for the crown. The kingdom was smaller, poorer, and less centralized than the great powers of continental Europe. Its rulers worried about rebellion at home and invasion from abroad. Across the Channel, France was consolidating. To the south, Spain and Portugal were opening sea routes that would transform global history. Portuguese ships moved down the coast of Africa and toward the Indian Ocean. Spanish expeditions crossed the Atlantic and encountered worlds unknown to Europe. Gold and silver began flowing into Iberian ports. Maps changed. Trade changed. War changed. England watched from the edge. At first, it arrived late. That delay would shape the kind of empire it built. Portugal and Spain claimed vast territories through royal authority and papal support. England, lacking the same resources, often depended on private investors, chartered companies, raiders, and settlements that were expected to survive with limited help from the crown. In 1497, John Cabot sailed under the English flag and reached the northeastern coast of North America. His voyage gave England a basis for later claims. But claims were easy. Control was not. For decades, England remained focused on Europe. Henry VIII broke with Rome, created the Church of England, seized monastic wealth, and dragged the kingdom through dynastic and religious upheaval. The split from Catholic Europe brought danger. It also encouraged English rulers and merchants to look outward. Protestant identity would become tied to national survival. Catholic Spain became not only a rival, but a symbol of everything England feared. Under Elizabeth I, that rivalry moved on to the sea. English mariners such as Francis Drake attacked Spanish ships and ports, often with quiet or direct royal support. They were celebrated in England as daring privateers. To Spain, they were pirates. The difference depended on which flag flew above the deck. Drake circumnavigated the globe and returned with treasure seized from Spanish interests. He was knighted. The message was clear. If England could not yet match Spain's empire, it could bleed it. This was one of the earliest habits of British imperial power. Use smaller forces. Strike trade routes. Exploit rivalries. Make profit, and wars serve the same purpose. In 1588, Spain sent the Armada toward England. The invasion failed because of English resistance, poor coordination, and violent weather. Later generations turned the victory into national mythology. A small Protestant island had survived the greatest Catholic power in Europe. But survival was not the same as supremacy. Spain remained formidable. England still had no vast overseas empire. Its first attempts at colonization were disasters. The colony at Roanoke vanished. Settlers starved. Investors lost money. Ships disappeared. The Atlantic was not waiting to be conquered. It was a graveyard for bad planning. Then, in 1600, Queen Elizabeth granted a royal charter to a group of merchants. Their organization would become the English East India Company. At first, it was simply one company among many. It wanted access to spices, textiles, and the wealth of Asian trade. It did not arrive in India as a conquering state. It arrived asking permission. Its representatives bowed before powerful rulers. They negotiated for warehouses and trading privileges. They competed with Portuguese and Dutch merchants. They operated in a region where the Mughal Empire possessed far greater wealth and military power than England. No one looking at the company's fragile early factories would have guessed that it would one day command armies, collect taxes from millions, and help topple one of the richest civilizations on Earth. But this was the empire's future in miniature. A commercial foothold, a fortified port, a private army, a local succession crisis, a treaty signed under pressure, then another territory, then another. In the same period, England was also changing internally. When Elizabeth died without an heir in 1603, James VI of Scotland became James I of England. The crowns were united, though the kingdoms remained legally separate. Over the next century, civil war, regicide, republic, restoration, and revolution transformed the British state. These conflicts were not separate from empire. They helped create the political and financial machinery that made empire possible. The monarchy learned that it could not rule without parliament. Parliament learned that war required revenue. Merchants learned that government could protect trade. Investors learned that public debt could finance fleets. And the navy slowly became the wall around the nation. Across the Atlantic, permanent colonization began. In 1607, English settlers established Jamestown in Virginia. The settlement nearly collapsed. Disease, hunger, conflict, and poor leadership killed many of the colonists. The survivors depended on trade, local knowledge, and reinforcements. Then tobacco changed everything. European demand turned the crop into profit. Profit demanded land. Land demanded labor. And those demands drove expansion, dispossession, and violence. English settlements spread along the Atlantic coast of North America. Some were founded for profit, some for religion, some as strategic buffers. They developed different societies, but all depended on taking or controlling land already inhabited by indigenous peoples. Agreements were made and broken. Wars erupted. Communities were displaced. Disease devastated populations that had no immunity to many infections brought from Europe. The empire did not advance across empty territory. It advanced into homelands. Meanwhile, the Caribbean became one of the most profitable and brutal centers of English expansion. Islands such as Barbados were transformed into plantation societies. Sugar, once a luxury, became a mass commodity. Its sweetness depended on forced labor. At first, English planters used indentured workers, many from Britain and Ireland. But as plantation agriculture expanded, they turned increasingly to enslaved Africans. The scale of suffering grew with the scale of profit. Men, women, and children were kidnapped, purchased, transported across the Atlantic, and sold as property. Families were separated. Bodies were worked to exhaustion. Resistance was punished with terror. Mortality was so high in some colonies that plantation owners continually demanded new captives. British merchants, ports, insurers, shipbuilders, and manufacturers profited from this system. Bristol, Liverpool, London, and Glasgow grew richer through trades connected directly or indirectly to slavery and plantation goods. The wealth did not remain on distant islands. It entered banks, estates, political influence, and industrial investment. The future empire was being financed by human captivity. This fact would later be softened in patriotic memory. Britain would celebrate abolition. It would be slower to remember how deeply it had profited before abolition arrived. In the 17th century, England also fought the Dutch, who possessed a powerful navy and sophisticated trading empire. The Dutch were not merely military rivals. They were teachers by competition. English merchants and statesmen studied Dutch finance, shipping, and commercial organization. They saw how maritime power could produce global influence. They also saw that no empire could survive on courage alone. It needed credit. It needed institutions. It needed the ability to keep ships at sea and armies supplied long after the excitement of war had disappeared. The turning point came through crisis. In the 1640s, England fell into civil war. King Charles I fought Parliament. The conflict tore through England, Scotland, and Ireland. It ended with the king's execution in 1649 and the rise of a republic under Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell's forces crushed resistance in Ireland with extreme violence, especially at Drogheda and Wexford. Land was confiscated. Catholic ownership was drastically reduced. The Conquest became a lasting wound in Irish memory and a warning of how the English state could combine ideology, settlement, confiscation, and military force. Ireland was not a distant colony. It was the empire's laboratory, close enough to control and close enough to fear. Methods later used overseas had already been practiced there. Plantations, settler communities, religious division, legal discrimination. The claim that conquest brought order. After the monarchy was restored, tension continued between crown and parliament. Then came the Glorious Revolution of 1688. James II was removed, and William and Mary took the throne under conditions that strengthened Parliament. This political settlement helped create a state that could tax more reliably, borrow more effectively, and reassure investors that debts would be honored. The Bank of England was founded in 1694. Government debt became a weapon. Britain could now raise enormous sums for war without collecting all the money immediately. Its rivals could win battles and still lose the financial struggle. Britain learned to survive longer. That endurance would matter more than brilliance. In 1707, the Acts of Union joined England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain. Scotland had suffered from a catastrophic colonial venture at Darien in Panama. Many Scottish investors were ruined. Union opened wider access to English colonial markets and institutions. Scottish merchants, soldiers, doctors, administrators, and settlers would become deeply involved in imperial expansion. The British Empire was not simply an English project. It drew people and resources from across the British Isles, even as power remained unequal and conflict persisted. By the early 18th century, the island kingdom had acquired the essential tools of global power: a growing navy, a tax system, public credit, commercial companies, Atlantic colonies, plantation wealth, experience in settlement and dispossession, a political class that increasingly understood war as a contest of economies, not only armies. But Britain was still not master of the world. France stood in the way. The next century would decide which power dominated the oceans. And the answer would be written in blood from Canada to the Caribbean, from Europe to India. The rivalry between Britain and France did not begin with one dramatic declaration. It grew through decades of war, trade competition, dynastic ambition, and colonial struggle. Each power wanted influence in Europe. Each wanted the wealth of the Atlantic. Each wanted access to Asia. And each understood that the other could not be allowed to control the sea. During the War of the Spanish Succession, Britain and its allies fought to prevent the crowns of France and Spain from creating an overwhelming block of power. The war ended in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht. Britain gained important territories and commercial privileges. Among them was the right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America through the Asiento Contract. This was presented as a diplomatic success. In reality, it was another door into the immense profits of human trafficking. British power expanded through respectable treaties and brutal commerce at the same time. The navy grew stronger. The merchant fleet grew larger. London became a center of finance. Insurance markets such as Lloyd's developed around the risks of shipping and trade. Coffee houses buzzed with news of cargoes, wars, prices, and distant opportunities. The empire was not managed only in palaces. It was discussed at docks, counting houses, taverns, and trading floors. Investors who would never see India could profit from Indian textiles. Landowners who had never visited Jamaica could spend plantation wealth in England. Consumers who knew nothing of enslaved labor could sweeten tea with Caribbean sugar. Empire entered ordinary life quietly. A cup of tea, a cotton dress, a mahogany table, a spoonful of sugar. Behind each object stood ships, labor, coercion, and global systems of exchange. In North America, Britain's colonies grew in population and confidence. Settlers pushed inland. Indigenous nations resisted, negotiated, traded, and fought to preserve their land and autonomy. The continent was not divided neatly between Europeans and native peoples. It was a complex world of alliances. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often called the Iroquois Confederacy, used diplomacy to balance colonial powers. French traders and missionaries built relationships across the interior. British colonists expanded from the coast. No European empire controlled North America as completely as its maps suggested. Lines on paper were ambitions, not facts. The decisive conflict came in the middle of the 18th century. In Europe, it became known as the 7 Years' War. In North America, part of it is remembered as the French and Indian War. But even those names failed to capture its scale. Fighting spread across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, India, and the oceans. Some historians call it the first truly global war. Britain entered the struggle with one great advantage. It could use its navy to strike the arteries of rival empires. British ships blockaded ports, seized colonies, protected commerce, and moved troops across vast distances. The strategy was expensive, but Britain's financial system allowed it to borrow, tax, and continue. In North America, British forces captured Quebec in 1759 after a campaign that included the famous battle on the Plains of Abraham. The victory helped destroy French imperial power in Canada. In the Caribbean, valuable sugar islands became bargaining pieces. In West Africa, trading posts changed hands. In India, the conflict opened an even greater opportunity. The Mughal Empire, once one of the strongest states in the world, was weakening after the death of Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707. Regional powers gained independence. Succession disputes multiplied. European trading companies began interfering more deeply in local politics. The French East India Company and the British East India Company supported rival claimants and built military forces made up largely of Indian soldiers under European officers. These soldiers became known as sepoys. The companies were no longer simply buying and selling goods. They were learning to make kings. In Bengal, one of the richest regions in the world, the British East India Company found its opportunity. Bengal's fertile land, textile production, and commercial wealth made it enormously valuable. The young Nawab, Siraj-ud-Daulah, distrusted the company's fortifications and political interference. Conflict followed. In 1757, company forces led by Robert Clive met the Nawab's army at Plassey. The battle itself was not a great military contest. It was a political collapse arranged through conspiracy. Clive and his allies had secretly negotiated with Mir Jafar, one of the Nawab's commanders. Much of the Bengal army did not fight. Siraj-ud-Daulah was defeated, captured, and killed. Mir Jafar was installed as Nawab. The East India Company gained enormous payments and influence. Clive returned to Britain fantastically wealthy. Plassey revealed a formula that would be repeated across the empire. Find a divided political system. Choose a local ally. Promise power. Use a small disciplined force. Win control without paying the full price of conquest. Then make the conquered territory finance the next conquest. But Plassey was only the beginning. In 1764, the company defeated a coalition of Indian rulers at the Battle of Buxar. The following year, the Mughal emperor granted the company the Diwani, the right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. A trading corporation had become a tax-collecting government. Its directors sat in London. Its officials made fortunes in India. Its army was largely Indian. Its authority came from a Mughal grant that it would gradually hollow out. Nothing like this had existed before on such a scale. The company had shareholders. It paid dividends. It also waged war, negotiated treaties, imprisoned opponents, and ruled millions of people. Private profit and public power became almost impossible to separate. The consequences in Bengal were devastating. Company officials and their intermediaries demanded revenue while exploiting trade privileges. Corruption spread. Local industries came under pressure. In 1769 and 1770, famine struck Bengal. Drought and crop failure were central causes, but the company's revenue demands and failures of administration worsened the catastrophe. Millions may have died, though exact numbers remain uncertain. Even as people starved, revenue collection continued. The company had conquered a rich province and nearly destroyed the system that made it rich. This was not simply cruelty. It was also incompetence produced by distance and greed. Men expected to become wealthy quickly. Directors expected dividends. Parliament expected strategic advantage. The people who paid the cost had almost no voice in the decisions. Back in Britain, the company's servants returned with fortunes and purchased estates and political influence. They were mocked as nabobs, men corrupted by sudden Eastern wealth. Public outrage grew, but so did dependence on the company. The British state could not ignore an organization controlling vast territories, nor could it allow the company to collapse. This pattern would become familiar centuries later in other forms. Private gain, public risk, government rescue. The 7 Years' War ended in 1763 with a spectacular British victory. France lost Canada and much of its position in India. Britain emerged as the leading naval and colonial power. The small island had beaten its greatest rival across the world. But victory created a new danger. The war had been enormously expensive. Britain's national debt had risen sharply. The government believed its American colonists should help pay for their own defense. The colonists saw the matter differently. They had grown accustomed to managing many of their own affairs. They had fought in the war. They distrusted standing armies. They resisted taxes imposed by a parliament in which they had no elected representatives. Britain had won a global empire and immediately faced rebellion at its center of growth. The dispute began with laws, duties, and constitutional arguments. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend duties. Each measure produced resistance. Colonial assemblies protested. Merchants organized boycotts. Crowds intimidated tax collectors. Pamphlets turned policy disputes into questions of liberty. British officials saw defiance. Colonists saw a conspiracy against their rights. The crisis deepened after the Boston Massacre in 1770 and the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Parliament responded with punitive measures known in Britain as the Coercive Acts and in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the laws helped unite resistance. In April 1775, fighting began at Lexington and Concord. The British Empire was at war with its own settlers. The rebellion contained a deep contradiction. Many colonial leaders spoke of natural rights while enslaving other human beings. Indigenous nations faced impossible choices between competing powers, neither of which offered security for their lands. Thousands of enslaved people sought freedom by fleeing to British lines after royal officials offered liberty to some who left rebel masters and served the crown. For them, the flag of the empire could represent a possible escape from men proclaiming freedom. The war was never a simple story of liberty against tyranny. It was a civil war, an imperial war, an international war, and a struggle in which different peoples pursued different definitions of survival. At first, Britain seemed to possess overwhelming advantages. It had a professional army. It had the world's strongest navy. It could hire German troops. It could capture major ports. But it faced the problem that would haunt empires throughout history. Winning battles was easier than controlling a vast hostile population. British forces captured New York and Philadelphia. They defeated George Washington repeatedly. Yet the rebellion survived. Distance slowed communication. Supply lines stretched across the Atlantic. American forces could retreat, rebuild, and return. The British government struggled to identify a political settlement that would restore loyalty without admitting defeat. Then France entered the war. The old rival saw a chance for revenge after 1763. French money, weapons, troops, and naval power transformed the conflict. Spain and the Dutch Republic also became involved against Britain. What had begun as a colonial revolt became another global war. In 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis was trapped at Yorktown by American and French forces while a French fleet blocked escape by sea. His surrender did not instantly end the war, but it broke the political will in Britain to continue the main campaign. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized the independence of the United States. Britain had lost 13 colonies. For another empire, this might have been the beginning of permanent decline. For Britain, it became a change of direction. The loss taught imperial leaders several lessons. Settler colonies could become dangerous if taxed without sufficient political accommodation. Local elites needed space to govern. Naval power did not guarantee political obedience. And the empire could not depend on North America alone. Britain looked east. It tightened control over India. It expanded in the Pacific. It developed new colonies in Australia. It strengthened its position in the Caribbean and Canada. The first British Empire, centered heavily on the Atlantic, had been wounded. The second would become larger, more bureaucratic, and more global. Even before the American War ended, British exploration was opening new possibilities. James Cook charted vast areas of the Pacific with extraordinary skill. His voyages increased European knowledge of ocean routes, coastlines, plants, peoples, and potential resources. They were presented as scientific exploration. They were also instruments of imperial claim. Maps were never neutral in an age of expansion. To name a bay, chart a coast, or raise a flag was to prepare the ground for those who would follow. In 1770, Cook claimed the eastern coast of Australia for Britain, calling it New South Wales. He did so despite the presence of Aboriginal peoples whose societies had existed there for tens of thousands of years. The legal fiction later called Terra Nullius treated the land as belonging to no one in a way recognized by British law. It turned ancient homelands into available property. After the loss of the American colonies, Britain needed a new destination for transported convicts. Its prisons were overcrowded. In 1788, the first fleet arrived at Botany Bay and then established a settlement at Sydney Cove. The colony began as a prison outpost. It became the foundation of a settler society. For the indigenous peoples of Australia, British arrival brought disease, land seizure, frontier violence, destruction of food sources, and the breakdown of communities. Resistance continued for generations. The British did not encounter an empty continent. They created emptiness through law and force, then described settlement as peaceful progress. This ability to turn conquest into paperwork would become one of the empire's most powerful tools. The American Revolution had shown that colonists might reject imperial control. Australia showed that Britain was still willing to build new colonial worlds. India showed that private companies could conquer old ones. And Europe was about to plunge into a conflict that would give Britain its greatest rival yet. In 1789, revolution erupted. In France, within a few years, monarchy fell, a republic was declared, and war spread across the continent. Out of the chaos rose Napoleon Bonaparte. He would dominate Europe as no French ruler had before. Britain would stand against him for more than 2 decades. And when the struggle ended, the balance of the world would be transformed. The wars against revolutionary and Napoleonic France tested every system Britain had built. The struggle lasted, with brief interruptions, from 1793 to 1815. Britain financed coalitions on the continent. It used subsidies to keep allies in the field. It mobilized industry, taxation, and credit. Above all, it relied on the Royal Navy. Napoleon could conquer capitals. He could destroy armies. But as long as Britain controlled the sea, he could not finish the war. The conflict reached its most famous naval moment in 1805 at Trafalgar. A British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson defeated the combined French and Spanish fleets. Nelson was killed during the battle, becoming a national hero. The victory did not defeat Napoleon on land. It did something more important for Britain. It made invasion far less likely and confirmed British command of the oceans. From that point, the Navy could blockade French trade, seize overseas possessions, and protect British commerce. The sea became a moving frontier of empire. British warships appeared wherever trade and strategy required them. Cape routes, Caribbean passages, Mediterranean harbors, Indian Ocean islands. No rival could easily move troops or cargo without considering British interception. This did not mean the Navy was invincible. It meant that Britain had built the world's most effective system for using maritime power at scale. The Navy depended on dockyards, forests, iron, rope, food, money, sailors, and global bases. Its strength came from an entire economy organized around endurance. While Napoleon reorganized Europe, Britain expanded overseas. It captured strategic colonies from France and its allies. It strengthened the Cape of Good Hope, an essential station on the route to India. It took Malta, giving it a powerful base in the Mediterranean. It occupied islands and ports that could support ships, deny access to enemies, and protect trade. Some territories were returned in peace settlements. Others remained. The empire grew through wartime possession followed by diplomatic selection. Britain did not need to keep everything. It needed the right points. A harbor at the entrance to a sea, an island beside a shipping lane, a fortress controlling a strait. Gibraltar, Malta, the Cape, Ceylon, Mauritius, and later Aden and Singapore formed parts of a network. Together, these places allowed Britain to move faster, refuel, repair, communicate, and project force. The empire often looked enormous on a map. Its true skeleton was a chain of strategic nodes. At the same time, Britain was undergoing an internal transformation more powerful than any single conquest. The Industrial Revolution changed production, transport, labor, and wealth. Coal-powered steam engines. Factories produced textiles on an unprecedented scale. Iron output increased. Canals and later railways moved goods more quickly. Cities expanded. A society once dominated by agriculture became the workshop of the world. Empire and industry fed each other. Colonies supplied raw materials and markets. British factories supplied manufactured goods. The Navy protected shipping. Banks financed expansion. Insurance reduced risk. State power opened markets when negotiation failed. But the relationship was not simple. Industrialization did not happen only because of empire, and the empire did not grow only because of industrialization. Yet together they gave Britain an advantage no earlier empire had possessed. It could manufacture weapons, ships, rails, and textiles at a scale that overwhelmed many rivals. It could move troops by steamship. It could send orders by telegraph. It could turn technological superiority into political pressure. The cost at home was severe. Factory labor could be exhausting and dangerous. Children worked long hours. Cities filled with smoke, disease, overcrowding, and poverty. The wealth of empire did not produce comfort for every British subject. Millions at home lived under harsh conditions while elites celebrated national greatness. The empire united rich and poor in patriotic language while dividing them sharply in material life. During these years, another struggle was unfolding inside British society. The campaign against the slave trade. Enslaved people had always resisted slavery through escape, revolt, sabotage, cultural survival, and everyday refusal. Their resistance was the central force against the system. In Britain, abolitionists built a political movement using petitions, pamphlets, testimony, religious networks, and consumer boycotts. Figures such as Olaudah Equiano described the horrors of enslavement and the Atlantic crossing. Thomas Clarkson gathered evidence from ships and ports. William Wilberforce led parliamentary efforts. Women organized boycotts of slave-grown sugar and played major roles in campaigning despite being excluded from Parliament. The movement forced British consumers to confront the violence behind familiar goods. But abolition was not a sudden moral awakening by an innocent nation. Britain had become one of the largest slave-trading powers in the Atlantic world. British ships had transported millions of enslaved Africans. British colonies remained dependent on forced labor. The debate was entangled with war, economics, religion, resistance in the Caribbean, and changing political ideas. In 1807, Parliament abolished the British slave trade. The Royal Navy began intercepting slave ships through the West Africa Squadron. Britain pressured other states to sign anti-slavery treaties. This became a powerful part of the empire's moral image. British officials increasingly claimed that imperial power could be used for humanitarian purposes. Yet slavery itself remained legal in most British colonies for decades. Enslaved people continued to labor under violence. In 1831 and 1832, a major rebellion in Jamaica, often called the Baptist War, demonstrated that the system could not remain stable. In 1833, Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act. Most enslaved people in the British Caribbean were legally freed, though many were forced into a transitional apprenticeship system that prolonged coercion. The government paid enormous compensation, but the money went to slave owners for the loss of what the law had treated as property. The formerly enslaved received no comparable compensation for stolen labor, violence, or generations of captivity. British taxpayers continued paying the debt associated with that compensation into the 21st century. The structure of wealth survived emancipation. Plantation owners invested elsewhere. Formerly enslaved communities struggled for land and economic independence. Colonial authorities often protected the interests of property owners. Abolition ended legal slavery in much of the empire. It did not end racial hierarchy, forced labor, or economic domination. Britain now told a new story about itself. It had become the nation that defeated Napoleon and abolished the slave trade. That story contained truth. It also concealed responsibility. The empire learned to present reform as proof of virtue while rarely surrendering power voluntarily. Napoleon's final defeat came in 1815 at Waterloo, where British-led and Allied forces under the Duke of Wellington fought alongside Prussian forces that arrived at a decisive moment. The victory ended the long war. France was contained. Britain stood as the world's leading naval and commercial power. No single state could challenge it across the oceans. The century after Waterloo is sometimes called the Pax Britannica, the British peace. But the name is misleading. There was no universal peace. Britain fought repeated colonial wars. It bombarded ports, invaded kingdoms, suppressed revolts, and expanded frontiers. The peace belonged mainly to the sea lanes Britain controlled and the European balance it preferred. For people on the receiving end of imperial power, the age could feel like permanent war. India became the central pillar of the empire. The East India Company continued expanding through conquest, alliances, and annexation. It defeated Mysore after long wars against Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. Tipu, ruler of Mysore, sought French support and adopted new military methods. He became one of Britain's most formidable opponents in India. In 1799, British and Allied forces stormed his capital at Seringapatam. Tipu was killed near the city's defenses. His death removed a major obstacle to company power in southern India. The company then confronted the Maratha Confederacy, a powerful collection of states that had risen as Mughal authority declined. Through a series of wars ending in 1818, the British defeated the Marathas and expanded control across much of the subcontinent. The company's method varied. Some regions came under direct rule. Others remained under princes who accepted British residence and military protection. These subsidiary alliances appeared to preserve local sovereignty. In practice, they often made rulers dependent on British power and forced them to pay for British troops stationed in their territory. If a ruler could not pay, land might be taken. If succession became disputed, the company intervened. If resistance emerged, the company described intervention as restoring order. By the early 19th century, the Mughal emperor remained in Delhi but possessed little real authority. The East India Company ruled in his name while steadily erasing the power behind the name. The company collected land revenue through systems that varied by region. In Bengal, the permanent settlement recognized zamindars as landholders responsible for fixed revenue payments. In other areas, officials dealt more directly with cultivators or village communities. Each arrangement was presented as rational administration. Each attempted to convert complicated local relationships into categories the colonial state could tax. Land became a number. Crops became expected revenue. Failure became debt. Officials measured villages they barely understood and demanded certainty from economies vulnerable to weather, war, and market change. The company also reshaped trade. Indian textiles had once been sought across the world. British industrial production now flooded markets with machine-made cloth. Tariff structures and imperial policy favored British manufacturers. Indian artisans faced devastating competition. Some adapted. Many lost livelihoods. At the same time, India continued producing valuable goods and raw materials for imperial trade, including indigo, opium, cotton, tea, and later jute. The empire did not simply take treasure and leave. It reorganized entire economies around distant needs. One of the most profitable and destructive trades involved opium. The East India Company cultivated opium under monopoly in India and sold it through controlled systems to private traders. The drug was smuggled into China despite Qing restrictions. British consumers wanted Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. China wanted relatively few British goods. Silver flowed east. Opium reversed the balance. Addiction spread. Chinese officials attempted to stop the trade. Britain responded in the name of commercial rights. In 1839, Commissioner Lin Zexu confiscated and destroyed large quantities of opium at Canton. The British government sent military force. Steam-powered warships and modern artillery gave Britain a decisive advantage in the First Opium War. China was defeated. The Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 opened treaty ports, imposed payments, and transferred Hong Kong Island to Britain. British rhetoric spoke of free trade, but the trade had been opened by cannon. Freedom for merchants meant coercion for the weaker state. A second war in the 1850s forced China into further concessions. British and French troops entered Beijing and looted and burned the old Summer Palace in 1860. The destruction was intended as punishment and spectacle. It showed how imperial warfare could turn cultural heritage into a target. The British Empire increasingly claimed to uphold law while exempting itself from the rules imposed on others. In treaty ports, foreign nationals gained special legal privileges. Chinese sovereignty was restricted. Commercial access became a right enforced by violence. This pattern extended beyond China. Across the 19th century, British officials and merchants built what historians often call an informal empire. Not every territory needed to be painted red on the map. If British banks controlled credit, British ships dominated trade, British diplomats influenced policy, and British gunboats could enforce agreements. Formal annexation might be unnecessary. Latin American states gained independence from Spain and Portugal, but British capital and commerce became highly influential in many of them. Britain supported open markets and opposed the return of European colonial monopolies. It presented this as liberty. It also benefited from becoming the strongest trader in the newly opened world. In the Ottoman Empire, Persia, Egypt, and elsewhere, British influence expanded through loans, advisors, infrastructure projects, and strategic pressure. Power could be exercised without a governor. This flexibility made the empire harder to define and harder to resist. A people might remain politically independent while their economy was shaped elsewhere. Britain's global reach depended increasingly on steam. Steamships moved against wind and current. Railways penetrated interiors. Telegraph cables compressed distance. A message that once took months could travel in hours or days. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, built under French leadership in Egyptian territory, shortened the route between Europe and Asia. Britain initially viewed the canal with suspicion. It soon recognized its importance. The route to India had become more direct. Protecting that route would influence British policy from Egypt to the Red Sea. Every technological advance promised connection. Every connection created a new point that had to be defended. The empire expanded partly because it feared losing what it already possessed. A port required a hinterland. A trade route required a naval base. A naval base required political influence. Influence required troops. Troops required revenue. Expansion created insecurity, and insecurity justified more expansion. This cycle would carry Britain deeper into Asia and Africa. But before the empire could claim the moral confidence of the Victorian age, it faced a rebellion at the heart of its power. In 1857, Indian soldiers in the East India Company's army rose against their officers. The uprising spread across northern and central India. Cities changed hands. Old rulers returned. Civilians were massacred. British retaliation became ferocious. For months, the future of British rule hung in the balance. The company that had conquered India was about to be destroyed by the empire it had created. The rebellion of 1857 did not have a single cause. It emerged from years of resentment, fear, annexation, economic disruption, religious anxiety, and military grievance. Indian soldiers formed the majority of the East India Company's armed forces. They had helped conquer territory for the company. Many served far from home under British officers who often treated them with racial contempt. Pay, promotion, and conditions created tension. High-caste soldiers feared that overseas service and new regulations threatened religious and social customs. Princes and landholders resented annexations. Peasants suffered under revenue demands. Artisans faced economic decline. Many Muslims and Hindus suspected that missionaries and officials intended to destroy their religions and convert India to Christianity. Some fears were exaggerated. Others were rooted in real policies and open arrogance. The immediate spark involved the new Enfield rifle. Soldiers had to bite open paper cartridges before loading. A rumor spread that the cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat. For Hindu soldiers, the cow was sacred. For Muslim soldiers, the pig was forbidden. British authorities mishandled the crisis. They denied, delayed, punished, and failed to understand how deeply trust had collapsed. In May 1857, sepoys at Meerut rebelled, killed officers and civilians, and marched to Delhi. There they declared the elderly Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar a symbolic leader. The Mughal dynasty, reduced to ceremony by the company, suddenly became the banner of revolt. The uprising spread to centers including Kanpur, Lucknow, Jhansi, and parts of the Gangetic Plain and central India. Not all of India rebelled. Many soldiers remained loyal to the British. Sikh forces, Gurkhas, princely states, and other groups played important roles on the British side for their own political reasons. Some communities saw the rebellion as a threat. Some saw British rule as the greater danger. Some waited to see who would win. The conflict was fragmented, local, and extraordinarily violent. At Kanpur, the killing of British women and children became a symbol of rebel brutality in the British press. At Delhi and elsewhere, Europeans and Indian Christians were killed. British forces responded with collective punishment. Suspected rebels were executed without meaningful trial. Villages were burned. Prisoners were tied to cannons and blown apart, a method designed to terrify and to deny normal burial rites. Racial hatred intensified. British newspapers demanded revenge. The language of civilization disappeared beneath the language of extermination. At Lucknow, British residents endured a long siege. At Jhansi, Rani Lakshmibai became one of the rebellion's most famous leaders. Widowed and denied recognition of her adopted heir under the company's doctrine of lapse, she fought against annexation. She died in battle in 1858 and became a lasting symbol of resistance. By the time the uprising was suppressed, both sides had committed atrocities, but only one side would control the official record. Britain presented the conflict as a mutiny by ungrateful soldiers. Later Indian nationalists remembered it as the First War of Independence. Neither phrase captures the entire event. It was a military revolt, a collection of regional rebellions, a civil conflict, and a struggle over the future of power in India. Its consequences were clear. The East India Company was finished. In 1858, the British government took direct control of its Indian territories. Company rule became the British Raj. Queen Victoria issued a proclamation promising religious non-interference, equal protection under law, and respect for princely states. The language was cautious and conciliatory. The structure beneath it remained imperial. India would now be governed in the name of the crown. The army was reorganized to reduce the risk of another unified rebellion. The proportion of British troops increased. Indian units were recruited according to theories of supposedly loyal and martial races. Artillery was kept largely under British control. Communities were classified, compared, and divided. The state became more suspicious and more informed. Officials collected data through censuses, surveys, ethnographies, maps, and legal codes. They claimed to be discovering India. In reality, they were fitting a vast and fluid society into categories that could be administered: religion, caste, tribe, and race were recorded as if they were fixed boundaries. Some identities became harder because the state treated them as permanent. Knowledge became another form of control. The Raj depended on a surprisingly small number of British officials. They ruled because the system recruited Indian clerks, soldiers, police, landholders, princes, professionals, and intermediaries. Without collaboration, no small foreign population could have governed hundreds of millions of people. But collaboration was not the same as consent. People entered the system for survival, ambition, local advantage, family duty, or lack of alternatives. The empire turned these choices into stability. It rewarded loyal elites. It preserved princely rulers under British supremacy. It educated a limited class in English to serve administration. It built institutions that created both supporters and future critics. Railways became the most visible symbol of British rule in India. By the late 19th century, thousands of miles of track connected cities, ports, military centers, and agricultural regions. Railways reduced travel times and linked markets. They allowed pilgrims, merchants, workers, and ideas to move more quickly. They also allowed troops to reach rebellions faster and raw materials to reach ports more efficiently. British investors received guaranteed returns, often paid from Indian revenues. Indian passengers and taxpayers carried much of the cost. The railway was both infrastructure and extraction. It changed India in ways no colonial planner could fully control. The same trains that moved soldiers also moved political activists. The same telegraph lines that carried official orders also spread news. The empire built networks that would later help organize resistance against it. British education created another contradiction. Officials such as Thomas Babington Macaulay argued for forming a class educated in English and familiar with British ideas. Schools and universities produced lawyers, journalists, teachers, and civil servants. These Indians read about liberty, representation, and the rule of law. Then they compared those principles with racial discrimination and foreign rule. The empire taught a language of rights that could be turned against empire. Yet the Raja's confidence remained immense. In 1876, Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. The title symbolized India's central place in British power. Indian revenues supported administration and military operations. Indian troops served in imperial campaigns from China to Africa and the Middle East. Indian markets mattered to British manufacturers. Indian princes attended imperial ceremonies designed to display hierarchy and loyalty. At grand durbars, tents, uniforms, elephants, medals, and ritual transformed domination into theater. Empire was not maintained by fear alone. It needed spectacle. It needed subjects to see power arranged before them and believe it permanent. But beneath the ceremonies, famine returned. India's climate had always produced periods of scarcity. Under colonial rule, the impact of drought interacted with taxation, market policy, transport, and administrative choices. The great famines of the late 19th century killed millions. Officials often insisted that markets should function without excessive interference. Some feared that generous relief would encourage dependency. Grain could move out of distressed regions while people lacked money to buy it. Relief camps sometimes demanded exhausting labor from starving people. The government gathered statistics while bodies accumulated. Not every death can be reduced to one policy. But colonial priorities shaped who was protected and who was allowed to die. An empire capable of moving soldiers across continents repeatedly failed to move enough food, money, and mercy to those most in need. Victorian Britain presented itself as modern, scientific, Christian, and progressive. The Great Exhibition of 1851 displayed machinery, manufactured goods, and imperial products beneath the glass roof of the Crystal Palace. Visitors saw a world organized around British industry. Cotton, timber, minerals, art, and inventions appeared as evidence of global leadership. The human cost behind these objects remained mostly outside the display. The exhibition offered a vision of empire without conquest. A world delivered to London as merchandise. This confidence shaped the ideology often called the civilizing mission. Missionaries sought converts and built churches, schools, and hospitals. Some opposed abuses and defended indigenous communities. Others treated local cultures as obstacles to be erased. Officials spoke of law, progress, and improvement. Settlers spoke of empty land and destiny. Racial theories became increasingly influential. Pseudoscience ranked peoples in imagined hierarchies. Social Darwinism misused ideas of evolution to justify domination. British victories were treated as proof of superiority rather than the result of weapons, organization, wealth, and political circumstance. The empire transformed power into virtue. If Britain ruled, many concluded, Britain must deserve to rule. This belief made violence easier to ignore. In settler colonies, the empire developed a different political arrangement. Canada had remained British after the American Revolution, but it included French-speaking Catholics, British settlers, indigenous nations, and later waves of immigration. Rebellions in Upper and Lower Canada in 1837 and 1838 exposed dissatisfaction with elite rule. The British government responded partly with repression and partly with reform. Responsible government gradually allowed colonial assemblies greater control over domestic affairs. In 1867, several colonies formed the Dominion of Canada. Canada gained substantial self-government while remaining within the empire. This was one lesson Britain had learned from losing the American colonies. Where settler populations of European descent were large and politically powerful, autonomy could preserve loyalty better than rigid control. But self-government did not include everyone equally. The expansion of Canada involved treaties, broken promises, land seizure, and policies aimed at assimilating Indigenous peoples. The reserve system restricted communities. The residential school system removed Indigenous children from families, languages, and cultures. Many suffered abuse, neglect, and death. These policies were implemented over generations by churches and governments in the belief that Indigenous societies should disappear into settler civilization. The violence was not always carried out on battlefields. Sometimes it wore the uniform of a teacher. In Australia, settler colonies expanded from coastal outposts. Gold discoveries in the 1850s brought migration and wealth. Colonies gained self-government. Sheep, mining, and trade connected Australia to British markets. For Aboriginal peoples, expansion meant continuing frontier conflict, dispossession, and demographic catastrophe. Massacres occurred across the continent. Children of mixed descent were later removed under policies that contributed to what became known as the Stolen Generations. As in Canada, democratic institutions developed for settlers alongside repression of Indigenous peoples. Freedom and empire grew together, but they were distributed by race. New Zealand followed a related but distinct path. British settlers arrived in growing numbers, and in 1840 representatives of the Crown and many Maori chiefs signed the Treaty of Waitangi. The English and Maori texts differed in important ways, particularly over sovereignty and authority. Disputes over land and power led to the New Zealand Wars. Maori communities resisted with military skill and political organization. Land confiscations followed. The treaty would later become central to claims for recognition and redress, but for much of the colonial period its promises were ignored or minimized. In each settler colony, the empire made agreements under pressure, interpreted them to its own advantage, and allowed settlers to become the dominant political force. The British world was becoming a family of unequal systems. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, white settlers moved toward parliamentary self-government. In India, Africans, Caribbean peoples, and many others remained subjects without comparable power. British political culture celebrated liberty at home and among selected settlers while governing most of the empire through hierarchy. This contradiction was not an accident. It was the structure. Ireland exposed it more clearly than anywhere. The Act of Union in 1801 joined Great Britain and Ireland into the United Kingdom. Irish representatives entered the Westminster Parliament, but the island remained deeply unequal. Much land was owned by landlords, many of them Protestant and sometimes absent. Catholic emancipation came only after prolonged struggle. Then, in the 1840s, potato blight destroyed the crop on which millions depended. The Great Famine killed around 1 million people and drove roughly another 1 million to emigrate, though estimates vary. Food continued to leave Ireland during the crisis. British policy provided relief but remained shaped by market ideology, administrative failure, prejudice, and fear of dependency. Workhouses and public works were inadequate. Officials often blamed the victims. The famine was caused by disease in the crop. Its scale became catastrophic because of poverty, land structures, political choices, and imperial indifference. Ireland's population collapsed. Families vanished. Ships carried desperate immigrants to North America and beyond. For many Irish people, the famine destroyed any belief that the Union protected them. The memory fed nationalism for generations. Britain's empire could send troops to India and warships to China. Yet within the United Kingdom, it failed to prevent mass death. This was the central paradox of Victorian power. The state appeared stronger than ever. Its capacity was real. Its compassion was selective. By the final decades of the 19th century, Britain possessed the world's largest empire, navy, merchant fleet, and financial center. London sat at the heart of a global network. Telegraph cables connected ministries to governors. Steamships shortened oceans. The pound sterling financed trade. British factories still produced enormous quantities of goods. But new powers were rising. Germany unified and industrialized. The United States expanded across a continent. Russia pushed deeper into Central Asia. France rebuilt its empire. Britain's lead was no longer guaranteed. Competition made imperial leaders more anxious, and anxiety drove them toward the largest land grab in modern history. Africa, long treated by Europeans as a coastline of forts and trading posts, was about to be divided on maps drawn thousands of miles away. For centuries, European powers had maintained forts and commercial relationships along parts of the African coast. They bought gold, ivory, palm oil, and enslaved human beings. But vast regions of the continent remained beyond direct European control. African kingdoms, empires, city-states, pastoral communities, and trading networks shaped their own political worlds. European maps often left the interior blank. The blankness represented European ignorance, not African emptiness. By the late 19th century, that ignorance became an invitation to conquest. Medical advances such as the use of quinine reduced, though did not remove, the deadly threat of malaria for Europeans. Steam navigation improved access to rivers. Repeating rifles and machine guns widened the military gap. Missionaries and explorers produced maps and reports. Merchants demanded markets and resources. Politicians feared that rivals would seize territory first. The result was the scramble for Africa. Between the 1880s and the early 20th century, European states claimed nearly the entire continent. Britain did not act alone. France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, and Spain all participated. But British possessions formed a vast chain from Egypt and Sudan toward East and Southern Africa, with additional colonies in West Africa. The motives differed from place to place. Some territories promised minerals. Some protected trade routes. Some were acquired because officials on the ground created crises and asked London to approve what they had done. Some were claimed mainly to prevent another empire from taking them. Imperial expansion was often less a master plan than a panic with flags. Egypt became essential because of the Suez Canal. The canal connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and shortened the journey to India dramatically. Egypt's ruler, the Khedive, had borrowed heavily from European creditors to finance modernization and grand projects. In 1875, facing financial crisis, he sold Egypt's shares in the Canal Company. British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli moved quickly to buy them. Britain now possessed a major financial stake in the route. Debt brought foreign control over Egyptian finances. Resentment grew among officers, officials, and the public. In 1882, a nationalist movement led by Ahmed Urabi challenged the Khedive and European influence. Britain bombarded Alexandria and invaded. British forces defeated Urabi at Tel el-Kebir. The occupation was described as temporary. It lasted for decades. Egypt remained formally part of the Ottoman Empire and retained its own ruler, but British officials controlled the most important decisions. This was empire through contradiction. An occupation without annexation. A protector who commanded the protected. A temporary arrangement with no clear end. From Egypt, Britain was drawn deeper into Sudan. An Egyptian administration, backed by Britain, had attempted to control the region. A religious and political leader known as the Mahdi led a powerful revolt. In 1885, Mahdiist forces captured Khartoum and killed General Charles Gordon, who became a martyr in Britain. More than a decade later, an Anglo-Egyptian army under Herbert Kitchener returned. At Omdurman in 1898, modern rifles, artillery, and Maxim guns devastated the Mahdiist forces. Thousands of Sudanese fighters were killed. British losses were comparatively small. The battle was celebrated as proof of modern military power. It was also a demonstration of industrial killing. Courage could no longer close the distance between a spear and a machine gun. The conquest of Sudan was described as revenge, order, and liberation from Mahdiist rule. It also secured the Nile and protected British interests in Egypt. Near Fashoda that same year, British and French forces confronted each other over control of the region. For a moment, two European empires stood close to war in the middle of Africa. France withdrew. Britain's north-south vision prevailed. African sovereignty barely entered the European discussion. In West Africa, Britain expanded from coastal settlements into territories that became Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, and the Gambia. Trade in palm oil and other commodities replaced the legal slave trade, but coercion remained central. Chartered companies signed treaties, raised forces, and claimed authority. Many African rulers believed they were making agreements of friendship or commerce. British officials often interpreted the documents as surrender of sovereignty. Where diplomacy failed, punitive expeditions followed. In 1897, a British force invaded Benin City after an earlier expedition had been attacked and largely destroyed. The city was looted and burned. Thousands of bronzes, ivory carvings, and other works were taken and sold or placed in museums. These objects were later admired as masterpieces in Europe, even as the society that created them had been dismissed as primitive. The theft exposed a recurring imperial habit: destroy a political power, seize its art, then display the art as evidence of universal culture under British guardianship. In East Africa, British interests focused on trade routes, the source regions of the Nile, in competition with Germany and other powers. The Imperial British East Africa Company attempted to administer territory but struggled financially. The British government took direct control. The Uganda Railway was built from the Indian Ocean toward Lake Victoria. Supporters called it a path to development. Critics mocked it as an expensive railway to nowhere. Thousands of laborers were brought from India to construct it. Many died from disease, accidents, and harsh conditions. Some remained, forming communities that would become central to East African commerce and later targets of racial politics. Railways again carried two meanings. They linked regions and created opportunity. They also served conquest, settlement, and export. In Kenya's highlands, European settlers took fertile land. African communities were pushed into reserves and pressured into wage labor through taxes and restrictions. The colonial economy needed workers. The state created conditions that made refusal difficult. Forced labor did not always involve chains. Sometimes it appeared as a tax payable only in money, in a society where money could be obtained only by working for the colonizer. In southern Africa, Britain encountered powerful African states, Dutch-descended settler republics, and immense mineral wealth. The Cape Colony had passed permanently into British hands during the Napoleonic era. Many Dutch-speaking settlers, later known as Boers or Afrikaners, resented British rule, including language policies and the abolition of slavery. During the Great Trek, thousands moved inland and established republics. But the interior was not unoccupied. They fought and negotiated with African societies, including the Zulu Kingdom and others. The discovery of diamonds near Kimberley and gold in the Transvaal transformed the region. Suddenly, control of land meant control of some of the richest mineral deposits on Earth. Imperial ambition intensified. One of its most aggressive figures was Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes made a fortune in diamonds and dreamed of British territory stretching from the Cape to Cairo. His British South Africa Company received a royal charter to expand northward. Through treaties, deception, and armed force, the company occupied territories later called Rhodesia. Rhodes presented expansion as civilization and destiny. His wealth came from monopoly and conquest. His vision depended on white supremacy. He was not an exception to imperial ideology. He was its ambition spoken without restraint. The British war against the Zulu Kingdom in 1879 revealed both arrogance and resilience. British officials issued demands designed to be rejected, creating a pretext for invasion. At Isenlwana, a Zulu army destroyed a large British column. The defeat shocked the empire. Men armed largely with spears had overwhelmed troops carrying modern rifles. But Britain could send reinforcements. The Zulu kingdom could not replace losses on the same scale. Later British victories crushed organized resistance and broke the kingdom apart. The empire often lost its first battle because it underestimated its opponent. Then it returned with more men, more guns, and no willingness to accept the political meaning of defeat. The two Boer republics created another challenge. Tension over British influence, Uitlander rights, and control of gold contributed to war in 1899. The Boers were skilled mounted fighters who knew the terrain. They besieged towns and inflicted humiliating defeats. Britain responded with massive reinforcements. When conventional Boer armies dispersed, commandos continued guerrilla warfare. British forces adopted a scorched earth strategy. Farms were burned. Livestock was destroyed. Civilians were removed to concentration camps. The term did not yet carry the later meaning associated with Nazi extermination camps, but conditions were deadly. Tens of thousands of Boer civilians, mostly women and children, died from disease and malnutrition. Black Africans were also confined in separate camps, where many died, and their suffering received far less attention. The war ended in 1902 with British victory. The Boer republics were incorporated into the empire. Only 8 years later, they joined with British colonies to form the Union of South Africa, a self-governing dominion. Political reconciliation between white British and Afrikaner leaders came at the expense of the black majority. The new state entrenched racial exclusion and helped lay foundations for the later system of apartheid. Once again, Britain extended self-government to settlers while denying equal political rights to the people who formed most of the population. At home, the Boer War damaged the image of effortless imperial superiority. The British Army had needed years and hundreds of thousands of troops to defeat a much smaller settler population. Reports of camp deaths caused outrage. Recruiters found many working-class volunteers in poor health, raising fears about national decline. The empire was vast, but the society at its center contained deep weakness. Patriotic celebration could not hide every cost. Still, imperial culture filled late Victorian and Edwardian Britain. Schoolbooks described heroic explorers and soldiers. Maps colored. British territories red. Adventure novels turned foreign lands into stages for British courage. Exhibitions displayed colonized peoples and products. Monuments honored generals. Queen Victoria's jubilees presented the monarchy as the center of a global family. Troops and dignitaries arrived from across the empire. The spectacle suggested unity. The reality was a hierarchy held together by force, trade, ritual, and unequal citizenship. Many ordinary people in Britain took pride in the empire without knowing much about how it worked. It offered a sense of belonging to something enormous. A dockworker in Liverpool, a clerk in Manchester, or a schoolchild in London could imagine participation in global power. Empire gave national identity and overseas horizon. But enthusiasm was never universal. Liberals, socialists, Irish nationalists, religious reformers, and anti-imperial critics challenged particular wars and abuses. J.A. Hobson argued that imperialism served financiers and wealthy interests more than the nation as a whole. Others condemned racial arrogance and militarism. Colonized intellectuals traveled to London, studied British institutions, and exposed hypocrisy at the center of the empire. The capital became both the command post of imperialism and a meeting place for its future opponents. Resistance across the empire never stopped. It took the form of armed rebellion, petitions, strikes, religious movements, legal challenges, journalism, migration, boycotts, and the preservation of language and culture. In Jamaica, the Morant Bay Uprising of 1865 grew from poverty, injustice, and lack of political voice. Governor Edward Eyre responded with martial law and brutal repression. Hundreds were killed, and the black politician George William Gordon was executed after a deeply flawed trial. The controversy divided Britain. Some defended Eyre as a man who saved the colony. Others saw murder under cover of law. The debate revealed a central imperial question. Did British rights apply to colonial subjects when authority felt threatened? Again and again, the answer was conditional. In India, new political organizations emerged. The Indian National Congress was founded in 1885. At first, many members sought reform rather than independence. They asked for greater Indian participation in government, fairer access to the civil service, and respect for rights Britain claimed to represent. Their language was moderate. British responses were often dismissive. Educated Indians were encouraged to admire British institutions, but treated as dangerous when they demanded them. In 1905, the colonial government partitioned Bengal, officially for administrative reasons. Many Indians believed the division was designed to weaken nationalism by separating communities. Protests spread through boycotts of British goods and the Swadeshi movement, which promoted local production. The partition was reversed in 1911, but political trust had deteriorated. New generations began to ask a more radical question. Why reform foreign rule when foreign rule itself was the problem? Similar questions appeared elsewhere. In Egypt, nationalists opposed British occupation. In Ireland, the demand for home rule divided politics. In West Africa and the Caribbean, an educated middle class challenged racial discrimination. In settler dominions, politicians wanted greater control over foreign affairs. The empire appeared strongest at the moment when its subjects were learning how to organize across it. Then, in 1914, Europe went to war. Britain entered the conflict against Germany. The government declared war from London. The empire followed. Men from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, Africa, and the Caribbean were drawn into a struggle that would consume millions of lives. For Britain, the empire became a reservoir of soldiers, labor, food, money, and raw materials. For the empire's peoples, the war became a test of loyalty, a source of suffering, and a promise that sacrifice might finally be rewarded. That promise would not be kept. The First World War is remembered through the trenches of France and Belgium. But the war was imperial from the beginning. The British expeditionary force that crossed the Channel was supported by a global system. Indian troops arrived on the Western Front in 1914, fighting in cold mud far from home. Canadian soldiers fought at Ypres and Vimy Ridge. Australians and New Zealanders landed at Gallipoli in 1915, where a disastrous campaign against the Ottoman Empire became central to their national memory. South Africans fought in Africa. Caribbean men served in labor and military units. African carriers transported supplies through campaigns in environments where disease killed on a terrible scale. Millions of animals were used and died. Colonial economies were redirected toward war. Food, minerals, taxes, and labor flowed toward imperial needs. Many subjects had no meaningful choice. In parts of Africa, forced recruitment triggered resistance. In Nyasaland, now Malawi, John Chilembwe led an uprising in 1915 against colonial oppression and the use of Africans in the war. The revolt was quickly crushed, and Chilembwe was killed. But his challenge exposed the absurdity of imperial demands. Africans were asked to fight for freedom and civilization under governments that denied them both. India contributed more than 1 million soldiers and laborers to the war effort. Indian revenues and supplies were crucial. Political leaders hoped loyalty would lead to substantial self-government. British officials offered gradual reform, but refused to surrender control. The gap between sacrifice and reward widened. The war also brought censorship, inflation, shortages, and disease. The influenza pandemic of 1918 killed millions in India, where malnutrition and strained administration worsened the disaster. The empire could mobilize bodies for war more effectively than it could protect them from hunger and infection. In the Middle East, Britain fought the Ottoman Empire and made overlapping promises. British officials encouraged Arab leaders to revolt against Ottoman rule, suggesting that independence might follow. At the same time, Britain and France secretly negotiated the Sykes-Picot Agreement, planning spheres of influence across Ottoman Arab lands. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration expressed British support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while stating that the rights of existing non-Jewish communities should not be prejudiced. The wording attempted to balance incompatible expectations without resolving them. Britain promised possibilities to different peoples because victory had not yet been won. After victory, it inherited the consequences. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. The League of Nations granted Britain mandates over Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan. Mandates were presented as a temporary responsibility to guide peoples toward self-government. In practice, They extended imperial control under international language. Britain now governed territories from Basra to Jerusalem while facing Arab nationalism, Kurdish aspirations, Zionist immigration, local resistance, and strategic concerns about oil and routes to India. The empire had gained land and lost clarity. In Iraq, a major revolt erupted in 1920 against British rule. Britain suppressed it with ground forces and air power, then established a monarchy under Faisal, who had participated in the Arab revolt. The arrangement reduced the cost of direct occupation while preserving British influence. This was a new version of an old method. Rule through a local government whose independence remained limited by treaties, advisors, military bases, and economic pressure. Air control became part of imperial strategy. Aircraft could survey territory, move quickly, and bomb rebellious areas at lower cost than large ground armies. Technology promised cheap domination. It also increased the distance between those who ordered violence and those who endured it. The war ended in 1918 with Britain on the victorious side. Its empire reached its greatest territorial extent in the years that followed. German colonies and Ottoman territories were redistributed. On maps, British power appeared larger than ever. But the appearance was deceptive. The war had killed a generation, multiplied debt, weakened trade, and strengthened rival economies. The United States had become a creditor and industrial giant. Japan had expanded its influence in Asia. Nationalist movements had gained confidence. The Dominions had signed the peace treaty separately and joined the League of Nations in their own right. The empire had won the war by mobilizing its parts. Those parts now expected greater control over their own futures. Ireland moved first and violently. For decades, Irish nationalists had demanded home rule. The issue was delayed by political conflict and then by the World War. In 1916, a group of Republicans launched the Easter Rising in Dublin. The rebellion was militarily defeated within days. Its leaders were executed by British firing squads. Public opinion, initially uncertain or hostile toward the Rising, shifted as the executions continued. The British government had turned defeated rebels into martyrs. In the 1918 election, Sinn Féin won most Irish seats outside the Unionist Northeast. Its representatives refused to sit at Westminster and declared an Irish Republic. The Irish War of Independence followed. The Irish Republican Army fought a guerrilla campaign. British forces responded with raids, reprisals, internment, and units including the Black and Tans, whose violence intensified hostility. Neither side could achieve an easy victory. In 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty created the Irish Free State as a self-governing dominion. 6 counties in the northeast remained within the United Kingdom as Northern Ireland. Partition satisfied neither Republican hopes for a united independent Ireland nor nationalist communities left north of the border. The treaty led to civil war among Irish nationalists. For Britain, it was both retreat and strategic compromise. Most of Ireland had broken from direct British rule after centuries of conquest, plantation, union, famine, and rebellion. The empire's first major 20th century withdrawal took place not across an ocean, but beside Britain itself. In India, wartime expectations collided with repression. The Government of India Act of 1919 introduced limited reforms, but the Rowlatt Acts allowed detention without trial and extended emergency powers. Protests spread. On April 13, 1919, thousands gathered in the enclosed Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar. Some came to protest. Others were present for a religious festival and fair. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer entered with troops, blocked the main exit, and ordered fire without warning. The soldiers fired into the crowd until ammunition was nearly exhausted. The official death toll was 379. Indian estimates were higher. Many more were wounded. People were shot while trying to escape. Some jumped into a well. The massacre shattered faith in British justice for millions. Dyer later claimed that he intended to produce a moral effect across Punjab. He succeeded, but not the one he imagined. He demonstrated that beneath constitutional promises stood the readiness to kill unarmed subjects. Some in Britain condemned him. Others raised money in his honor. The divided reaction showed how empire had shaped moral judgment. To one audience, Amritsar was a crime. To another, it was necessary firmness. For Indian nationalism, it became a point of no return. Mohandas Gandhi emerged as the most influential leader of the independence movement. He had developed methods of nonviolent resistance while confronting racial discrimination in South Africa. In India, he transformed politics by linking elite demands with mass participation. His campaigns used non-cooperation, marches, boycotts, fasting, and civil disobedience. Gandhi's politics were not without critics or contradictions. Revolutionaries believed nonviolence was too slow. B.R. Ambedkar challenged caste oppression and disagreed with Gandhi on the political protection needed by Dalits. Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the Muslim League increasingly argued that Muslim political interests required separate safeguards and eventually a separate state. Subhas Chandra Bose sought more militant paths to independence. India's freedom movement was never the work of one man. It was a vast, divided struggle involving workers, peasants, students, women, religious communities, princes, radicals, constitutionalists, soldiers, and millions whose names are not remembered. In 1930, Gandhi marched to the sea to protest the British monopoly on salt. Salt seemed an ordinary substance. That was precisely why it mattered. The colonial government taxed something every person needed. By picking up salt from the shore, Gandhi turned a basic act into a challenge to imperial authority. The march attracted global attention. Thousands were arrested. Demonstrators were beaten. The empire could imprison leaders. It could not easily explain why Indians should not make salt in India. The moral language of rule was collapsing under the weight of simple questions. The interwar empire faced economic crisis as well as political unrest. The Great Depression reduced trade and commodity prices. Colonial producers suffered as exports lost value while debts and taxes remained. Governments promoted imperial preference, trying to increase trade within the empire. The idea of a self-contained British world gained appeal. But economic nationalism could not reverse the long shift of power toward the United States and other industrial economies. Britain was still a global center of finance and shipping. It was no longer the unchallenged workshop of the world. The Dominions gained greater constitutional independence through the Statute of Westminster in 1931. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the Irish Free State, and Newfoundland were recognized as autonomous communities equal in status within the British Commonwealth, though adoption and practical effects varied. The old language of empire was slowly being replaced by partnership among self-governing states. But this partnership remained racially restricted. India was not equal. African colonies were not equal. Caribbean colonies were not equal. The empire could imagine freedom most easily for populations it saw as extensions of Britain. Elsewhere, it continued to insist that independence must wait. In Palestine, British rule became increasingly unstable. Jewish immigration rose, especially as persecution intensified in Europe. Zionist institutions expanded. Palestinian Arabs feared displacement and loss of political control. Britain issued contradictory policies, sometimes restricting immigration and land sales, sometimes supporting the framework of a Jewish national home, and repeatedly attempting compromise. The Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 challenged British rule and Zionist settlement. Britain deployed large forces, conducted mass arrests, demolitions, executions, and collective punishments. Palestinian political and military structures were badly weakened. The conflict did not end. It waited beneath the approaching World War. Across the empire, resistance and reform existed beside daily life. People did not wake each morning thinking only about imperial rule. They raised families, traded, worshipped, celebrated, argued, studied, and created art. Colonial societies were not passive stages for British action. They changed the empire from within. Indian food, language, textiles, and ideas entered Britain. Caribbean sailors and workers moved through British ports. African and Asian students studied in London. Political activists formed networks across oceans. The empire produced migration in every direction. It made Britain more global, even as British politics often imagined the colonies as distant possessions. Then fascism rose in Europe. In Germany, Adolf Hitler built a racial dictatorship and prepared for expansion. Italy invaded Ethiopia. Japan conquered Manchuria and launched a wider war in China. The international order weakened. Britain faced a terrible strategic reality. Its empire stretched across the planet, but its military resources were limited. It had to defend the home islands, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, and global shipping routes. The map that once represented strength had become a map of vulnerability. In September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany after the invasion of Poland. Once again, the empire entered the struggle. But this time, the war would not merely weaken British rule. It would make the old empire impossible to preserve. The Second World War began with Britain still commanding the largest empire on Earth. Within 9 months, much of Western Europe had fallen to Nazi Germany. France collapsed in June 1940. Britain stood exposed across the Channel. For a time, the empire appeared to be the source of survival. Canadian industry and troops supported the war effort. Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, and colonies across Africa and the Caribbean supplied men, food, metals, bases, and money. Pilots from across the Commonwealth and occupied Europe fought in the Battle of Britain. Indian soldiers served in North Africa, the Middle East, Italy, and Southeast Asia. West and East African troops fought in campaigns against Italy and Japan. Caribbean workers traveled to Britain and North America. The war was presented as a defense of freedom against tyranny. That message had enormous force. It also raised an unavoidable question. If freedom was worth defending in Europe, why was it still denied across the empire? British leaders tried to postpone the answer. They could not prevent colonial subjects from asking it. The Atlantic Charter of 1941, issued by Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, spoke of the right of peoples to choose their form of government. Churchill later insisted that the principle did not apply in the way Indian nationalists hoped. To him, the British Empire was not comparable to Nazi conquest. To many colonized people, the distinction did not erase foreign rule. The language of self-determination had escaped the control of those who used it. The war also destroyed the myth of British invincibility in Asia. Japan attacked British, American, and Dutch possessions across the Pacific and Southeast Asia in December 1941. Japanese forces advanced with shocking speed through Malaya. British commanders had underestimated them, relied on racial stereotypes, and prepared poorly for an attack through jungle terrain. The battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse were sunk by Japanese aircraft. The naval shield failed. In February 1942, Singapore surrendered. More than 80,000 British, Indian, Australian, and local troops became prisoners. Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. For Asian observers, the meaning was even greater. White imperial power had been defeated by an Asian state. Japan's occupation brought its own violence, forced labor, hunger, massacres, and exploitation. It was not liberation, but the fall of Singapore shattered the psychological foundation of European rule. The British could return after the war. They could not restore the old aura. In Burma, brutal fighting continued for years. The British Indian Army expanded into one of the largest volunteer forces in history, numbering more than 2 million men by the end of the war. Indian soldiers were essential to Allied victory in Asia. At the same time, Subhas Chandra Bose formed the Indian National Army from prisoners and expatriates, allying with Japan in the hope of driving Britain from India. The army's battlefield impact was limited, and its alliance with an authoritarian empire remained deeply controversial. But later trials of its officers stirred nationalist feeling across India. Even soldiers who had remained loyal to the British could understand the desire for independence. The colonial military itself was becoming politically uncertain. In 1942, the Indian National Congress launched the Quit India movement, demanding an immediate end to British rule. Gandhi and other leaders were arrested before the movement could coordinate effectively. Protests, strikes, sabotage, and repression followed. Thousands were killed or wounded, and many more imprisoned. Britain held India through force during the greatest war in its history. Then, in 1943, famine devastated Bengal. The causes remain debated in detail, but wartime inflation, crop disease, loss of rice imports after the Japanese conquest of Burma, market failure, speculation, administrative decisions, and unequal access to food all contributed. The British government prioritized military needs and was slow to provide adequate relief. Churchill's wartime cabinet has faced enduring criticism for its response and for the Prime Minister's contemptuous attitudes toward Indians. Several million people died, though estimates vary. Photographs showed emaciated bodies on the streets of Calcutta while the empire continued fighting a war for civilization. The famine exposed the limits of imperial obligation. India was valuable enough to supply soldiers and resources. Its poorest people were not powerful enough to command rescue. By 1945, Britain was victorious. It was also exhausted. The war had consumed wealth, damaged cities, expanded debt, and made the country dependent on American support. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. Both opposed traditional European colonialism for their own different reasons, even while building spheres of influence of their own. Anti-colonial movements had grown stronger. European authority had been humiliated in Asia. British voters elected a Labour government committed to rebuilding the welfare state at home. Maintaining the empire by endless force no longer seemed financially or politically possible. India could not be held without a level of repression that Britain was unwilling or unable to sustain. The question was no longer whether British rule would end. It was how, and how quickly. The answer came with terrible speed. Religious and political divisions had deepened during the late colonial period. The Indian National Congress claimed to represent a united India, though its leadership was largely Hindu in background, and the Muslim League feared permanent Muslim vulnerability in a Hindu-majority democracy. Muhammad Ali Jinnah demanded Pakistan, a separate homeland for Muslims in the Muslim-majority regions of the Northwest and Northeast. British constitutional plans failed to reconcile competing visions. Communal violence increased. In 1946, killings in Calcutta, Noakhali, Bihar, Punjab, and elsewhere revealed how close the subcontinent was to catastrophe. Lord Louis Mountbatten arrived as the final viceroy with instructions to transfer power. The date was moved forward to August 1947. A boundary commission led by Cyril Radcliffe was given only weeks to divide Punjab and Bengal. Radcliffe had never visited India before. He worked with incomplete maps, conflicting data, political pressure, and an impossible deadline. The final boundary was announced after independence celebrations had already begun. India and Pakistan were born. British rule ended, and millions discovered that they were now on the wrong side of a line. Hindus and Sikhs fled toward India. Muslims fled toward Pakistan. Trains arrived filled with corpses. Villages were burned. Women were abducted, raped, forcibly converted, or killed by members of other communities and sometimes by their own relatives in the name of family honor. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Armed groups attacked refugee columns. Perhaps 14 million people were displaced, and estimates of the dead range from several 100,000 to around 1 million or more. No exact number can contain the human reality. Partition was shaped by Indian political conflict, communal fear, colonial policies, and hurried British withdrawal. It cannot be explained by one villain or one decision. But Britain, after nearly 2 centuries of expanding administrative control, departed without securing an orderly transition in the region it had called the jewel in the crown. The ceremony of independence could not silence the screams along the new borders. Gandhi refused to celebrate in Delhi. He spent the period trying to stop communal violence. In January 1948, he was assassinated by a Hindu extremist. The empire had ended in India, but the wounds of division remained. Kashmir became disputed almost immediately, leading to war between India and Pakistan and a conflict that endured across generations. East Pakistan later became Bangladesh after a brutal war in 1971. The lines of 1947 continued to shape armies, identities, migration, and nuclear rivalry. A border drawn in weeks became a reality defended for decades. Elsewhere, Britain's retreat produced different outcomes. In Palestine, British authorities faced escalating conflict among Palestinian Arabs, Jewish armed organizations, and the Mandate government. The Holocaust had intensified the urgency of Jewish demands for refuge and statehood. Palestinian Arabs opposed the loss of their homeland and political future. Britain restricted some immigration, intercepted refugee ships, and became the target of attacks by Zionist militants. Unable to resolve the conflict, Britain referred the issue to the United Nations and ended the Mandate in May 1948. The State of Israel declared independence. Arab armies entered the war. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were expelled in what Palestinians remember as the Nakba, the catastrophe. Jewish communities across the Arab world would also face displacement and upheaval in the following years. Britain did not create every force behind the conflict, but its policies, promises, repression, and withdrawal helped shape the conditions in which the disaster unfolded. The imperial habit of balancing incompatible commitments had reached its limit. In Southeast Asia, Britain returned after Japan's defeat, but faced nationalist movements that had no intention of restoring the pre-war world. Burma gained independence in 1948 and chose not to join the Commonwealth. Ceylon, later Sri Lanka, became independent the same year through a more negotiated process. Malaya was strategically valuable because of rubber and tin. A communist-led insurgency began in 1948, drawing support largely from parts of the ethnic Chinese population. Britain declared an emergency. The term allowed insurance companies to treat the conflict as something other than war, protecting plantation and mining interests from denied claims. Language followed money even in rebellion. British forces combined military action, intelligence, political reform, and population control. Hundreds of thousands of rural people, mainly ethnic Chinese, were moved into guarded settlements called new villages to separate guerrillas from food and support. The campaign was more effective than many later counterinsurgencies, but it depended on coercion as well as reform. The Federation of Malaya gained independence in 1957. The emergency continued until 1960. In Kenya, demands for land and freedom produced another violent confrontation. European settlers had taken fertile areas, especially in the Central Highlands. African political demands were restricted. From the early 1950s, a movement often called Mau Mau launched an insurgency, drawing much of its support from the Kikuyu community and targeting colonial authorities, settlers, and Africans seen as loyalists. The British government declared an emergency in 1952. The rebellion included brutal killings. The colonial response was vastly larger and systematic. Tens of thousands were detained without normal trial. Villages were enclosed. Prisoners suffered forced labor, beatings, torture, sexual abuse, and execution. For years, official narratives minimized the violence. Later evidence and legal cases forced wider recognition of colonial abuses. Britain defeated the insurgency militarily. It did not preserve colonial rule. Kenya became independent in 1963 under Jomo Kenyatta, whom the British had once imprisoned and portrayed as connected to the rebellion's leadership. The man treated as a threat became the leader of the new state. This transformation repeated across the empire. Yesterday's extremist became tomorrow's president. Yesterday's terrorist became tomorrow's negotiating partner. The labels changed when power changed. In the Gold Coast, Kwame Nkrumah led mass politics demanding self-government. After imprisonment and negotiation, he became prime minister. In 1957, the colony gained independence as Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African colony under British rule to do so in the post-war wave. Ghana's independence inspired movements across the continent. Nigeria became independent in 1960. Sierra Leone and Tanganyika followed in 1961. Uganda in 1962. Kenya in 1963. Other territories followed. The speed of decolonization revealed how quickly supposed permanence could dissolve once belief in permanence disappeared. But independence did not erase colonial structures. New states inherited borders designed for imperial convenience. They inherited economies focused on exporting a small number of commodities. They inherited bureaucracies built to command more than represent. They inherited armies and police forces shaped by colonial priorities. Different communities had been governed through unequal access to education, land, and office. Political leaders now had to build nations inside boundaries they had not drawn. Some succeeded in creating periods of stability and growth. Others faced coups, civil wars, authoritarianism, debt, or external intervention. Colonialism was not the only cause of every later crisis, but it set the stage on which those crises unfolded. The empire's global humiliation came in 1956 at the Suez Canal. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the canal company after Britain and the United States withdrew support for the Aswan High Dam. Britain's Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, saw Nasser as a dangerous dictator who could not be allowed to control the route. Britain, France, and Israel secretly planned military action. Israel invaded Sinai. Britain and France issued an ultimatum and then attacked, claiming to separate the combatants and protect the canal. The deception was quickly exposed. The United States opposed the invasion and applied financial pressure. The Soviet Union issued threats. International condemnation grew. Britain was forced to withdraw. Militarily, British and French forces could still seize territory. Politically and financially, Britain could no longer act against the will of the United States. Suez made visible what had already become true. The empire's age of independent global command was over. A small island had once used debt, sea power, and alliances to outlast larger rivals. Now debt and alliance restrained the island itself. Britain continued to possess territories and bases. It remained a nuclear power, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, and an important financial and military state. But it was no longer the center around which the world turned. The Caribbean moved toward independence as well. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago became independent in 1962. Barbados followed in 1966. Others followed through different constitutional paths. Many retained the British monarch as head of state for a time or permanently, while some later became republics. The Commonwealth offered a framework of voluntary association. It allowed Britain to replace direct rule with diplomatic connection and shared institutions. For some members, it provided practical cooperation. For Britain, it softened the image of imperial retreat. The family language remained. The authority behind it had changed. In southern Africa, decolonization was more difficult because of white settler power. South Africa had become legally sovereign within the Commonwealth and then left it in 1961 after criticism of apartheid. In southern Rhodesia, the white minority government issued a unilateral declaration of independence in 1965 to resist transition to majority rule. Britain refused formal recognition but did not use military force to remove the regime. Years of sanctions, guerrilla war, and negotiation followed. In 1980, the territory became independent Zimbabwe. The delayed transfer revealed the racial hierarchy that had always shaped imperial constitutional development. Settler autonomy, once encouraged, had created governments willing to defy Britain to preserve minority power. One of the last great imperial crises occurred in the South Atlantic. In 1982, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, whose sovereignty was and remains disputed by Argentina and the United Kingdom. Britain sent a naval task force thousands of miles and retook the islands after a short but deadly war. The victory revived memories of maritime power and demonstrated that Britain could still defend distant territories. But it did not restore the old empire. The conflict was over a remaining possession, not a path to new expansion. In 1997, Britain transferred Hong Kong to China after more than 150 years of colonial rule, with Hong Kong Island and Kowloon having been ceded after 19th-century wars and most of the territory held under a 99-year lease. The handover ceremony was watched around the world. Rain fell. The Union flag was lowered. The event is often treated as the symbolic end of the British Empire. But empires do not end on a single night. They leave institutions, wealth, language, migration, law, architecture, military bases, family histories, and unresolved arguments. Today, the United Kingdom still retains overseas territories scattered across the globe. The Commonwealth connects many former colonies, though its members have very different relationships with Britain and with their imperial past. English is a global language partly because of empire. Common law systems, parliamentary forms, civil services, sports, schools, and rail networks bear British influence. These institutions have been adapted, transformed, rejected, and made local. They cannot be described simply as gifts. Many were built to make rule more efficient. Many were financed by colonized peoples. Many served extraction before they served citizenship. Yet people took them, changed them, and used them for purposes the empire never intended. The same English language used by governors became the language of anti-colonial speeches. The same courts used to enforce imperial law became places to demand rights. The same railways built to move troops helped connect national movements. The empire's tools escaped imperial control. Its economic legacy is equally complex. Britain accumulated wealth through trade, industry, finance, plantation slavery, colonial taxation, and access to global resources. Not every British fortune came from empire. Not every colonial project produced profit. Many cost more than they returned directly to the state. But empire shaped opportunities, protected investments, opened markets, and moved wealth toward the center. The distribution of that wealth remains visible in estates, museums, companies, ports, and institutions. Across former colonies, extractive economies, and unequal land systems often survived independence. Arguments over reparations, restitution, and responsibility continue because the material past did not vanish with the flag. Museums hold objects taken during conquest or under conditions of extreme inequality. Communities ask for their return. Defenders of retention argue for universal access and preservation. Critics ask why universality always seems to place the treasure in the former imperial capital. The debate is not only about bronze, marble, jewels, or manuscripts. It is about who has the authority to tell history. Migration brought the empire home. After the Second World War, Britain needed workers. People from the Caribbean, South Asia, Africa, and other parts of the Commonwealth arrived to rebuild the country and build new lives. The ship Empire Windrush, which arrived in 1948 carrying passengers from the Caribbean, became a symbol of this generation. These migrants were citizens or subjects of a world Britain had created. Yet many encountered racism, housing discrimination, violence, and exclusion. Britain had ruled diverse peoples for centuries, while often refusing to imagine them as fully British. The empire had taught millions to look toward London. When they arrived, London sometimes acted surprised. Their children and grandchildren transformed British culture, politics, food, music, literature, medicine, business, and public life. Modern Britain cannot be understood without the empire, not because the empire exists unchanged, but because its people live in the same streets. Memory remains divided. Some remember railways, legal systems, military service, and a sense of global connection. Some remember massacre, famine, land theft, racial humiliation, and forced labor. Many families remember both opportunity and injury. The empire was too large and lasted too long to produce one experience. A merchant in Bombay, an enslaved woman in Barbados, a Maori chief, a Canadian settler, a Nigerian clerk, an Irish tenant, an Australian convict, a Sudanese fighter, and a London investor did not inhabit the same empire, even when the same crown claimed them. That is why simple verdicts feel satisfying and fail. The British Empire was not purely a heroic project that accidentally committed abuses, nor was every road, school, law, or human connection meaningless because it emerged under domination. It was a system built to advance British power and interests, capable of adaptation, reform, and occasional restraint, but always based on profound inequality. At its center stood a decision that some people had the right to rule others without their consent. Everything else followed from that. The Navy could protect commerce because someone paid the taxes. The plantation could produce sugar because someone was enslaved. The railway could move cotton because someone had lost control over land and markets. The map could appear peaceful because resistance had been defeated, hidden, or renamed. The ceremonies could appear magnificent because suffering was kept outside the frame. And yet the empire was never all-powerful. It depended constantly on local allies, soldiers, translators, merchants, clerks, chiefs, princes, and workers. It survived by dividing opponents and negotiating with people it could not simply crush. Its rulers often misunderstood the societies they claimed to know. Its victories created new problems. Its roads carried rebels. Its schools produced nationalists. Its wars exhausted its wealth. Its claims about freedom became weapons in the hands of those it ruled. The same system that made the empire enormous also made it impossible to hold forever. Distance demanded delegation. Delegation created local power. Education created political expectation. War demanded sacrifice. Sacrifice demanded reward. Racial hierarchy denied that reward. The contradiction widened until the structure broke. So how did a small island rule a quarter of the world? Not because British soldiers were always better. They were defeated many times. Not because British leaders possessed a perfect plan. They often improvised, blundered, and contradicted one another. Not because the empire was welcomed. It faced resistance from beginning to end. Britain succeeded because it combined advantages more effectively than its rivals at critical moments. An island position protected by sea, a navy supported by taxation, industry, and credit, a financial system that could fund long wars, merchants willing to take risks, companies able to act like states, a talent for choosing strategic ports and routes, a willingness to use local divisions, an ability to rule through existing elites, industrial power, and, when persuasion failed, organized violence on a global scale. But those tools explain expansion better than they explain endurance. The empire lasted because millions of people made daily choices inside it. Some benefited, some resisted, some collaborated and rebelled at different moments. Some found ways to survive a system they could not escape. History becomes dishonest when it reduces all of them to loyal subjects or helpless victims. They were political actors living under unequal conditions. They shaped the empire even when they did not control it. At its greatest extent, the British Empire seemed to have defeated geography. Ships crossed oceans under its flag. Cables carried orders beneath the sea. Trains cut across continents. The pound moved through markets. The monarch's image appeared on coins from one hemisphere to another. But the empire never defeated time. Every colony created people who remembered what had been taken. Every school created readers who could compare promise with reality. Every war created veterans who had seen British weakness. Every reform admitted that the old order was unjust. Every act of repression revealed fear. And every lowered flag made the next one easier to imagine. The sun finally set, not in one dramatic collapse, but across hundreds of ceremonies, negotiations, rebellions, elections, partitions, and departures. Sometimes independence arrived with celebration, sometimes with civil war, sometimes with a constitution prepared over years, sometimes with a border drawn in weeks. The empire left slowly in some places and too quickly in others. It apologized rarely. It remembered selectively. And it survived in language long after it disappeared from maps. The red territories faded. The consequences did not. They remain in the border between India and Pakistan, in the conflict over Palestine, in the museums of London, in the railways of Africa and Asia, in the wealth of old port cities, in the diversity of modern Britain, in legal systems, military traditions, school curricula, and family stories, in pride, in anger, in silence. The British Empire ruled a quarter of the world because it mastered the systems of its age better than any rival. It lost that world because the people inside those systems learned to master them too. History remembers the maps. But maps do not show hunger. They do not show the frightened clerk signing a treaty he cannot refuse. They do not show the enslaved child aboard a ship. They do not show the soldier freezing in a foreign trench. They do not show the family running toward a train during partition. They do not show the student reading the word liberty and realizing it must include him. The true empire was never the red color on paper. It was the distance between those who made decisions and those who paid for them. And when that distance could no longer be defended, the greatest empire the world had ever seen became a collection of memories arguing with one another. Perhaps that is its final lesson. Power can cross oceans. It can purchase loyalty. It can draw borders, command armies, and rewrite laws. It can convince itself that domination is duty. But it cannot rule forever over people who have begun to imagine a future without it. The British Empire once claimed that the sun would never set on its dominions. In the end, the sun did not destroy it. The people living beneath that sun did. Was the British Empire remembered more for the world it connected or for the wounds it left behind?